Let's get into the life and times of Thomas Sankara. Now, Thomas Sankara was an African revolutionary who eventually gained control of the ex-French colony Upper Volta and renamed it Burkina Faso, and changed the all-around government for his short time there until he was later assassinated. In Sankara's life and story, we see some of the same mistakes made by people before him. Along with changing the name of the country, he also changed the formation of the government, which led to his popularity and, ironically enough, to his death as well. In Sankara's life, we see many things that were admirable, but also mistakes made that can be learned from. So let's get into Thomas Sankara. For this video, the recommended reading and the books I'll be using are Thomas Sankara, an African Revolutionary by Ernest Harsht, and Thomas Sankara Speaks, a collection of his speeches. So, Thomas Sankara was born December 21st, 1949 in central Upper Volta, as the territory was called then. Thomas grew up in a large family. 2 sisters were born previously, but he was the first son. 8 more brothers and sisters came afterward, and another sister died in infancy. As the oldest boy, Thomas saw it as his duty to help care for and protect his siblings. His early years were spent in Jewa, a town in the humid southwest, to which his father was transferred as an auxiliary gendarme. As the son, as one of the few African functionaries then employed by the colonial state, Thomas enjoyed a relatively privileged position. The family lived in a brick house with the families of other gendarmes at the top of a picturesque hill overlooking the rest of Jewa, but Thomas played with other children and sat alongside local classmates once he started primary school. So he soon became aware of their conditions and of the wider world around him. So he's coming from this upper middle class kind of upbringing for his area. First thinking that's the normal upbringing until he's having interactions with the majority of Upper Volta at the time, which were in poverty. In the 1950s, Upper Volta was still a colony of France. The territory had initially been conquered by the French army in 1895. Even then, not all communities were pacified until the suppression of a major revolt among the people of the West and of the northern Sahel in 1915-1916. At the time, the territory was part of a larger French West African colony. Only in 1919 was it formally established as a separate colony called Upper Volta. Viewed from Paris, Upper Volta was a minor colonial possession of little material value except to grow cotton or to provide conscripted young men to work on roads, railways, and plantations in other French colonies. So we're going to see the common theme with Upper Volta that we see with most of late 17th, 18th, 19th century colonies by the Imperial West, be it France or Britain, largely maintained for capitalist type interest and eventually all taken back by the indigenous people. So eventually a lot of these French colonies, even as they remained French colonies, kind of broke off into different countries because there was, be they all African, a lot of different ethnic groups of Africans being lumped in together, and this did also lead to conflict with each other. Compared with the practice in France's richer colonial territories, Paris sent relatively few French administrators or colonists to Upper Volta. There were enough in Jewa, however, for the young Thomas to notice how differently they lived from the African population and how much more privileged were the European children of his age. Occasionally he got into scraps with European children in school or around town. Although his father often took his side in such disputes, he also disciplined him at home for getting into conflicts. When Thomas was 11 years old, just a few days before Upper Volta attained its formal independence from France, he and some friends organized their own mock ceremony to lower the French flag and to raise the colors of the new nation. That led to a brawl between the European and African boys. Although Thomas himself was not involved, the school director demanded that his father punish him with a beating. His father refused. So the times are changing, and Upper Volta is getting its independence. Well, its independence in name only. It was still, even though it wasn't officially part of France anymore, it was still, through influence, through loans, essentially still a colony of France. Meanwhile, the country was experiencing political turmoil. Upper Volta's first president, Maurice Yameogo, was never particularly an aspiring figure, having ascended to independence rather reluctantly. He maintained a strong connection to France, with numerous French advisors working in both the army and the civil administration. Over time, Yameogo became more autocratic and jailed many critics. He appointed relatives to key positions and engaged in extravagant personal spending while simultaneously imposing austerity on state employees and cracking down on trade unions. So he's literally doing all the wrong things you would do as a leader, so obviously this isn't going to go on too long. He appeared oblivious as his unpopularity grew. On January 3, 1966, workers launched a general strike, and large crowds of students, unemployed youths, workers, petty traders, and others poured into the streets in a veritable popular insurrection. After army officers refused to follow the president's orders to disperse the demonstrators by force, it was clear that Yameogo was finished. He agreed to resign and hand over power to the army commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sangul Lamizena. And that's how it happens with popular revolts too. Revolts of the populace is, even though the military and the police are still officially in the hands of the power, in this instance Yameogo, if it is a populist revolt, they won't fire on their fellow citizens because their family's going to be there. In fact, they're going to agree with them. And this is how you get the military apparatus to turn against their check signers. Because until there's something of a populist nature like took place here against Yameogo, they'll always be willing to suppress smaller insurrections. So I think it is the same with America. When a true populist revolt comes about, you will have the military and police apparatus refuse to inflict violence on their fellow citizens when there's enough of their citizens demanding a change. I mean a true populist revolt like what was going on in Upper Volta that got Yameogo out of office. So after all this, Sankara took the entrance exam and passed. He joined the Academy's first intake of 1966 at the age of 17, stepping onto the same career path that his father had once pursued. The Academy also taught its trainee officers a variety of academic subjects, including the social sciences. For those topics, it employed civilian professors. One was the academic director, Adama Touré, who taught history and geography. Although known for some progressive ideas, Touré did not openly air all his views. That would have been risky in such a political and social conservative country. Only years later was it revealed that he belonged to a clandestine African Independence Party, PAI, a regional Marxist group centered in Senegal and with branches in several other former French colonies. Touré invited a few of his brightest and more politically inclined students, Sankara among them, to join informal discussions outside the classroom. Touré talked about imperialism and neocolonialism, socialism and communism, the Soviet and Chinese revolutions, the liberation movements in Africa, and similar topics. Although Sankara had already become politically aware, this was the first time he was exposed in a systematic way to a revolutionary perspective on Upper Volta and the world. So this professor is pretty much opening his mind to different political realities and revolutionary ideas. This was probably his launching pad into what his future self would go on to do. Among the works used in the classes were some by Marxist authors or well-known French development thinker René Dumont. Several professors were left-wing French academics. and Sankara sometimes had dinner with them. What they should have also had on their reading list was Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. As we will see later on, Sankara could have learned a little bit from Machiavelli. Sankara advanced his political education through more than books and discussions. He was able to personally witness revolutionary change. His last year in Madagascar, this is where he was going to schooling at, coincided with an unprecedented period of political upheaval marked by peasant revolts, general strikes, huge public demonstrations against the conservative pro-French regime, and finally a military takeover that steadily brought even more radical officers into high positions of power. So, topped with revolutionary ideology, he gets to see a revolution play forth right in front of his eyes. So, I'd imagine that was probably a pretty powerful experience, especially when your head is filled with revolutionary ideals. And then you see in another area that actual physical revolution take place and overcome the system. I gotta believe that's a strong motivator to wanting to do that where you're from as well, and thinking that that is even achievable because you've seen it happen right in front of your eyes. Sankara's approach to the new army recruits under his charge was different than what previously existed. He found the established military training programs rather archaic, largely copied from those of the French army in the era of Napoleon Bonaparte. So he adapted them and coupled the military training with civic education, as he had learned in Madagascar. In addition to sports and athletic activities on Sundays, he organized civic classes on Saturday mornings, covering topics such as the rights and duties of citizens and the powers of the legislature, military, and courts. So he's building political soldiers right here. At first, the recruits were resentful that some of their free time was taken up by the courses, but eventually they became more interested. According to Bruno Jaffari, one of his biographers, Sankara regarded the recruits' awakened interest in civic affairs as confirmation of his optimism in human nature and encouragement to engage in other similar actions. In 1976, La Mizina appointed Sankara, now a lieutenant, to take charge of a new National Command Training Center based in Po, a relatively small town far from the southern border with Ghana. The center designed to train the elite fighting units that the army lacked. For the more than 4 years he commanded the center, the position provided Sankara with an opportunity to develop more fully the kinds of innovative trial programs without having to report daily to any superiors. Sankara worked as well to raise the soldiers' civic awareness and intellectual acumen. Yet, organizing educational activities was not a simple task. Books were few in Po, so every time Sankara or his colleagues went to Quahadago, they came back with books, some of a political nature. So they're in a pretty shitty situation there, where they don't even have enough books at their elite command training center. Since the goal was to produce citizen soldiers who viewed themselves as serving the wider society, Sankara also initiated development projects in which his troops worked directly with local communities. In one instance, the center joined with a non-governmental organization to dig wells and improve residents' access to water. On another occasion, he secured a contribution of musical instruments which were given to the soldiers with some aptitude to form a band. Sankara, with his guitar, participated in the rehearsals and even some of the performances. So his political beliefs are now manifesting a bit into reality. During this period, he met a young woman, Mariam Sarim. They began seeing each other regularly, and a romance deepened. They married in Ouagadougou in 1979 in a simple ceremony in a small Catholic church. In August 1981, Sankara became a father with the birth of his and Miriam's first child, Felipe. In one of the poorest nations in the world, Upper Volta's 7 million inhabitants had an annual average per capita income of just $210 in 1980. Less than 1 in 10 lived in the city, and the adult literacy rate scarcely reached 11%. So only 11% of their adults could read, at best. So this is a pretty primitive mass at this time, and I think that's how colonialism worked best is when you only had a small minority. I mean, if you look at like the plantation method in the Americas, in the early days of slavery in this country, you had essentially your field workers, and then you had what they would call your house nigger. And they had more privileges. They oversaw. Same in the slave plantation format, and same in the colonial format. You keep the masses essentially very, very basic, and you keep a minority with some education, some learning, and some extra privilege. So it's to their advantage to keep up that cycle as well. So, and of course, Sankara, he wants to change this. He wants to make his country more educated. His lifestyle growing up was he was one of the 11% in that country that had access to the education that was necessary to be literate. Only 18% of school-age children were in primary school, and a bare 3% made it to secondary school. Recurrent droughts, soil erosion, and stagnant crop yields meant that hunger was common. Poor nutrition and disease cut lives very short. Average life expectancy was an abysmal 44 years. So not the best situation to be born into. But the funny thing about these types of situations, if that's all you know, you think that's normal. So it's not even a hardship because, hey, this is just how it is. Most people were thinking. So I think this is what keeps most people stagnant too. I mean, we can parallel that to modern day America. Most people think, hey, this is just what it is. You know, yeah, it sucks here, sucks there, but this is just what it is. There's no changing that. This is why it always takes these revolutionary thinkers, these actors, to come in and you know, essentially shake everyone awake and say, no, this isn't just what it is. This can change. So Sankara, fueled by anger at such a reality, Sankara's conviction deepened that fundamental change must come. During his visits to Ouagadougou and on yet more military training missions to France and Morocco, he systematically pursued contacts with those who thought likewise. Some were in the military, including Blaise Compaoré, whom Sankara first met during the war with Mali, and then again at a training course in Morocco. In 1978, he made Compaoré his deputy commander at the Po Training Center. So Compaorés, automatically, they become good friends, and so much so that Sankara, gets him as his right-hand man. To Sankara and his colleagues, a scent of change seemed to be in the wind. The politicians of the old conservative political parties were in disarray. Strikes were becoming more common across the country. Public anger was mounting over the recurring exposure of corruption scandals involving both military officers and civilian bureaucrats. Yet Sankara's study of revolutions had taught him that it could be foolhardy to act precipitously. So he bided his time, at least for a little while longer. So he's seeing, once again, I think you can parallel this to today. Like he's seeing their old conservative party is kind of falling apart. It's falling apart because of its corruption within itself, its inefficiency to get anything productive done on a large scale, and you're having a lot of pushback and blowback to that. So there's discontent with the system. Obviously, people are desiring some sort of change, although there was divided. Just like today, there's many different groups in Upper Volta, some more communistic than others, and more left, and some more to the right, but yet what they all had in common was this discontent with the current system. As the 1980s opened, the government of Sangoul Lamizena had already been in office for nearly a decade and a half. Compared to the experience of some Upper Volta's more volatile and highly repressive West African neighbors, Lamizena's rule was relatively stable and not especially strict. Yet his government's relative laxity came with a corollary. There was very little effort to tackle the country's severe social and economic problems. Development initiatives were minimal at best, while those in high office, with the apparent exception of the president himself, freely used their positions to advance their own personal interest and aggrandizement. So it sounds like the president wasn't necessarily a bad person, but he wasn't doing much to change anything, and he wasn't doing much to stop the corruption that was going on around him. On November 25th, 1980, a group of senior officers led by Colonel Sayet Zerbo mounted a coup, adopting the name the Military Committee for the Enhancement of National Progress, or the CMRPN. They deposed the government, detained Lamizena and other officials, scrapped the Constitution, dissolved the National Assembly, and suspended all political parties and activities. Zerbo, a veteran of French military campaigns in Indochina, cited an erosion of state authority under Lamizena among the reasons for his coup. He vowed to instill discipline within the state and fight corruption, and to that end set up commissions to study civil service reform and investigate malpractice by officials of the previous regime. The coup was initially popular. The new government set up by the CMRPN included some progressive nationalist civilian ministers and enjoyed the support of some trade unions. As an acknowledgement of Sankara's military command abilities, as well as his political following, he was promoted to captain in January 1981 and named head of the Army's operational division. He soon was asked to take on a ministerial position in the government. Sankara refused. In a careful worded letter to Zerbo, he cited a personal free and conscious decision to not accept any political post. Some of his civilian revolutionary friends agreed with that decision. Others urged Sankara to take up the offer, arguing that outright rejection could expose him and his comrades to retaliation. Finally, after some negotiation, Sankara reluctantly agreed to become Minister of Information. He insisted, however, on two conditions: that his deputy at the Commando Training Center in Po, Blaise Compaoré, take over as its commander, and that Sankara serve as a minister for only 2 months until a replacement could be found, although his tenure ultimately stretched to 7 months. So he's really bringing around this Compaoré character. This is his Brutus, essentially, and it's surprising how either things change within people that would change a Compaoré to, and spoiler for people that don't know the story, Compaoré is the one that turns against him and has him killed in the end to take power himself. And he would later become president of that country for like 27 years or something to that extent. So, but it always surprises me, like, when people either don't see it, because this, I believe, was either always a part of his character or it's something he later came into, but that like someone like Sankara just wasn't more aware of this person, or how Compaoré's mind would have changed, at one time being idealistic and revolutionary until later becoming more material, self-serving, and pessimistic. But as you see, Compaoré wouldn't be where he was at, or even in the position to mount an assassination eventually against Sankara, if it hadn't been for Sankara continually pulling him up with him. As Sankara climbed the ladder, he dragged Compaoré up there with him. So from the outset, Sankara functioned like no other government minister up to that time. With the flair for dramatic gesture, he pedaled to work each day on a bicycle rather than drive in a state-issued car. The sight of the cabinet minister bouncing along Ouagadougou's dusty streets just like other citizens sent a clear message of the kind of public servant he intended to be. A legitimate man of the people type. Meanwhile, political and social tensions in the country were again sharpening. While the CMRPN's promises to clamp down on corruption and profiteering proved to be of limited substance, its reaction to political dissenters took on a much harder edge. Outspoken student activists were detained as labor unions continued to demand better living and working conditions. The authorities responded by suspending the right to strike, dissolving the most militant of the union federations, and ordering the arrest of its central leaders. Sankara also decided that the time had come to end his participation in the government. Since the CMRPN had ignored his earlier request to be relieved of his functions, Sankara finally took the initiative himself. He made his exit in a particularly theatrical and politically charged fashion. On April 12, 1982, just 3 days before the officers of the CMRPN were to hold the first major review of their time in office, Sankara sent a formal letter of resignation to the president. In it, he criticized the CMRPN for its class character and for serving the interest of a minority. He also announced his resignation publicly and live over the radio, during a speech at the closing session of a conference of African ministers responsible for cinema, with President Zerbo present at the event. He issued a strong plea for freedom of expression, concluding with the words, "Woe to those who would gag their people." And, this was a very smart move at the time. I don't know if it was Machiavellian enough in his head or not, but to make a public address like that, probably saved him of his life, because it would get a lot of ears listening and build his popularity. And then if they executed him right away for saying something like that, kind of, essentially defying the president in his face publicly as well, that there may have been more blowback from that because of the public address. That if he had just resigned with that letter and essentially said what he said publicly in that letter in a private matter, you could see it would have been easier to kind of just bury him away, pleading for freedom of expression and then, getting killed right after it. You can see how that would definitely stoke the flames. The senior officers reacted promptly by arresting Sankara. They also demoted him a rank and deported him into a military camp in the western town of Didogu. Although communication among the core leaders of the radical officers' wing was now more difficult, they were able to remain in sporadic contact, while others took a more direct role in keeping the network active. They were emboldened by the CMRPN's increasing political isolation. Some of Zerbo's rivals within the fractionalized army raised the idea of another coup and quietly approached the radicals to join the anti-Zerbo plotters. In discussions with his colleagues, Sankara rejected that option, arguing that a strictly military takeover would not be able to initiate fundamental political and social change. Instead, he maintained, it was necessary to first elaborate a political platform in conjunction with the civilian movements and revolutionary groups. Though Sankara's supporters held back, other officers moved ahead to military action, led principally by Commander Gabriel Urian, the Army Chief of Staff. On November 7, 1982, they overthrew Zerbo's CMRPN and proclaimed a new military-led government, which they called the Council of the Welfare of the Peoples, or CSP. The new body was a coalition of individuals and factions united only by opposition to the Zerbo regime. It initially had no agreed political platform and no established leadership, enabling the radicals to push it into somewhat a progressive direction. Their influence was evident in the CSP's first declarations, which condemned the Zerbo regime for waste, corruption, illicit enrichment, and repression of students and workers. They also won agreement to restructure the CSP as a wide consultative body of 120 representatives from all military units in the country. Ultimately, Jean-Baptiste Arago, the little-known head of the Army's medical service, was the compromise choice as president. Although the revolutionary-minded junior officers were just one component of the broad coalition in the new CSP, they exerted greater influence than ever before. One of the body's first acts was to restore Sankara, Compaore, and Zango to their previous ranks as captain. The following month, on January 10, 1983, an extraordinary assembly of the CSP acknowledged Sankara's growing political standing by naming him prime minister. This time he readily accepted. He thus became an official number 2 to President Arago, and more important, was in charge of coordinating the day-to-day work of various ministries. When Sankara took his formal oath of office on February 1st, he vowed that he and other government members were to serve the people, not to serve themselves. And by the people, he specifically meant peasants, workers, artisans, artists, students, and democratic organizations that defended the interest of the popular masses. The people wanted freedom, he said, but This freedom should not be confused with the freedom of a few to exploit the rest through illicit profits, speculation, embezzlement, or theft. He urged state personnel to get out of their air-conditioned offices, experience the concrete living and working conditions of ordinary citizens, and set a practical example of probity, honesty, and love of work well done. Sankara also represented Upper Volta at the Suman meeting of developing countries of the non-aligned movement in New Delhi the second week of March. When Sankara finished, President Orogo stepped to the podium to read his own speech, but he had been clearly upstaged by his prime minister. His own address was delivered in a markedly lower key and had a more moderate message. Some weeks later, on May 14th, another rally was organized in Bobo Dioulasso. A similar scenario played out. Sankara elicited a very enthusiastic response from the members of the youth organizations invited to the rally. When President Orogo stood up next to address them, he was greeted with first silence. Then as he spoke, the crowd began to disperse amid chants of Sankara, Sankara. Sankara's various pronouncements at home and abroad cemented his alliance with the country's main revolutionary political groups. But they also alarmed the more conservative officers in the CSP and apparently the French authorities as well. 2 days after the Bobo Dioulasso meeting, Guy Penet, the African Affairs advisor to President Francois Mitterrand, arrived in the country for an official visit. Early the next morning, May 17th, armored units surrounded Sankara's home and took him into custody. With Sankara out of the way, Orogo met later that day with Penet, who promised generous financial aid from France. Protests erupted almost immediately. Over May 20th to 21st, large and sometimes violent demonstrations rocked Ouagadougou, which is their main city in Upper Volta, or Burkina Faso as it is today, involving high school students, youths from poor neighborhoods, and some trade unionists. Protesters cried, "Free Sankara," and chanted anti-imperialist slogans, particularly against France, widely regarded as the promoter of the coup. The demonstrations, together with the defiance of the commando base in Po, prompted the authorities to relent somewhat. Sankara was freed for a while in an effort to start negotiations. Sankara was even permitted to travel to Po, where he was greeted as a hero. As a political stalemate seemed to set in for the next 2 months, the Sankarist camp gradually consolidated its position. Sensing that a new regime change was imminent, political discussions between the young officers and civilian groups advanced to the point of sketching out a general political platform and deciding who would be named to key ministerial positions. Clandestine committees of civilian supporters were formed, drawn from the leftist groups, student movements, and trade unions. Meanwhile, Sankara continued to negotiate with President Orogo in the hopes of arranging a peaceful political transition and avoiding bloodshed. At a meeting with Sankara on August 4th, Orogo reportedly indicated his willingness to resign as president. Now, this is definitely one theme throughout Sankara's life, is he went out of his way to avoid violence. And I think even to his own detriment in the end. I mean, if we go by Aristotelian ethics, we see that too much of anything and too little of anything is not good. That usually there's a moderation. And the same could be said for violence, in my opinion. Too much violence is obviously bad. Not enough violence is also bad. Sometimes violence is necessary for progress. And I think that fact has played out all throughout human history. When Sankara and his colleagues took power on August 4th, 1983, they called their leading body the National Council of the Revolution, CNR. The name signaled to anyone who might have been in doubt that their goal was a sweeping political and social change. While the CNR would be in the lead in spurring such changes, Sankara insisted that ordinary people also had to organize and take initiative. In response to his first radio broadcast as president appealing to everyone, man or woman, young or old, to form popular organizations, the new Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, CDRs, began to emerge within a few days. The first arose in a rather disorganized manner in Ouagadougou's poorer neighborhoods and then spread more systematically over the next few months to other towns and most of the approximately 7,000 rural villages. Decision-making in the CNR was collective, and on some occasions proposals favored by Sankara were overruled. But Sankara clearly was the CNR's most influential member, and his energy, acumen, and oratorical skills ensured that he would be its most visible public face. Sankara delivered the CNR's main programmatic declaration, known as the Political Orientation Speech, in October, 2 months after the takeover. It included a broad critique of the established order as well as an ambitious agenda for transformation. There was little difference between colonial rule and neo-colonial society, Sankara said, except that some nationals had taken over as agents of foreign domination. While the 23 years of Upper Volta's independence was paradise for the wealthy minority, for the majority, the people, it is barely a tolerable hell. Sankara identified the main domestic opponents of revolutionary change as parasitic classes, and the tradition, reactionary forces in the countryside. In contrast, the main proponents were the people, principally workers, the petty bourgeois, and peasants. And the reactionary forces are essentially the chiefs of the outer villages, who for the longest time were essentially little leaders of each village now, and that distinction was being taken away from them underneath the CNR's new policies. The character of the revolution, he said, was democratic and popular. Its long-term goal was to eliminate imperialist domination and exploitation and to purge the countryside of all social, economic, and cultural obstacles that keep it in a backward state. Sankara's use of the term democratic, it should be noted, drew from notions of a participatory democracy, not Western-style electoral models. In fact, one of CNR's first measures was to outlaw the country's established political parties, which were seen as tools of the old elites. So this is common in collectivism, be it fascism, be it communism, be it anything in between, that typically once a party has gained power, they eliminate the competition, because if the goal is unity, you can't achieve that when you have 15 different parties going 15 different ways and all, attacking each other endlessly and just causing and stoking the flames, stoking the fire of division in people. So typically they're done away with, and all debate and argument about way forward is usually held within the party. No elections to representative parliamentary bodies were envisaged. The absence of elections, except within the framework of the obviously partisan CDRs, was later seen as one of the Sankara's government's major shortcomings, even by most of those who continued to follow his ideas. Despite the rhetoric of people's participation, there was insufficient channels through which popular ideas and grievances could be transmitted upward. So despite the effort, what they're suggesting is there's a break between the people's committees and then the parliamentary function that would serve Sankara. At least enough of a disconnect where that criticism could be injected here in this work that looks at Sankara in a largely positive light. Throughout Sankara's October 1983 address and other speeches, the influence of Marxist ideas was evident. Sankara readily acknowledged his appreciation of the Russian, Chinese, and Cuban revolutions. During visits to his office, it was easy to spot volumes of Marx and Engels on his bookshelves and a bust of Lenin on his desk. Sankara read widely, including the Bible, the Quran, and writings by many non-Marxist revolutionaries and other progressive thinkers. Whatever his personal views, Sankara was careful not to tag labels of socialism or communism onto the revolutionary process he was helping to lead. Upper Volta, he pointed out, was an extremely underdeveloped country with little industry and just a tiny wage-earning working class. Under the circumstances, the process there was anti-imperialist revolution. That was unfolding within the limits of a bourgeois economic social order. The most important tasks facing revolutionaries were therefore to fight against external domination, construct a unified nation, build up the economy's productive capacities, and address the population's most pressing social problems, illiteracy, hunger, and disease. To symbolize the rebirth, the CNR changed the country's name in August 1984, during the first anniversary of its assumption to power. The territory once labeled Upper Volta would henceforth be called Burkina Faso, translated roughly from two different indigenous languages as Land of the Upright People, which is a pretty good name for a country, I would say, just like Iran was Land of the Aryans. Kind of the same sentiment here. Kind of sets a precedent for your society when you name it that. Besides emphasizing integrity and probity as essential characteristics of the new state, the name also signaled its indigenous identity with its citizens, projected to be proud Africans. Whatever people thought of Sankara's grand ideas for the country, they soon became aware that his day-to-day conduct was markedly different from that of any previous president. At times, with theatrical symbolism, he openly disdained the customary pomp and ceremony that generally came with high office. Official portraits of the president, so common in public buildings across Africa, were prohibited. Young activists were discouraged from chanting his name. He was normally driven to meetings and public events not in limousines, but in modest cars. Once a week he played soccer with his advisors and staff, and passerbys could see him dressed in shorts and a jersey. Sometimes he appeared unannounced at public events, participants only gradually becoming aware of his presence when they glanced to the side or rear and saw him quietly standing there, perhaps wearing a tracksuit. Such informality was designed to send a message that leaders should be modest and that especially in such a poor country, they should not live the high life. In 1987, Sankara's last year, he publicly declared all the sources of income and assets of himself and his wife Miriam. They were quite modest. He clearly had not used his position to amass wealth. His two sons remained enrolled in public school. Miriam continued to report daily for her job at the government shipping agency, where she was a transportation specialist. Paul, his younger brother, said that Sankara told all family members that they should not anticipate any benefits because of his political position, in contrast to the common practice in much of Africa, and much of anywhere else as well. He explained to everybody how we shouldn't expect anything from him. So it's admirable what he's trying to do here, but once again, you have to have some kind of balancing factor here. That moderation, that middle ground. He's going out of his way to be a normal citizen, essentially, or to appear as such, even though he's not. But not having his picture up anywhere, not allowing youth groups to chant his name, showing up unannounced, and even, dressing poorer and traveling poorer than other citizens in his country, which, like I said, it's admirable, but it's just not in the way of reality. There's a certain status you should show if you're in the position of power, and it's not to be gaudy and to go overboard with it, but it's definitely something that is there, that has to be noticed, that has to be present. I mentioned Machiavelli earlier. Let's see what Sankara could have learned here from Machiavelli. He says, "It being my intention to write a thing which shall be useful to him to apprehend it, it appears to me more appropriate to follow up the real truth of the matter than the imagination of it. For many have pictured republics and principalities which in fact have never been known or seen, because how one lives is so far distant from how one ought to live, that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than preservation. For a man who wishes to act entirely up to his professions of virtue soon meets with what destroys him among so much that is evil. And this is exactly what went down in Sankara's case. His idealistic view of everything, as genuine as it was, as pure as it was, as positive as it was very naive and short-sighted and ignoring the reality around him. And this is what Machiavelli's speaking about here. You have to take human nature into factor. When you take power, even if you do it non-violently, to maintain that power, you're going to have to use violence or the threat of. So it didn't do his people, his beliefs, his cause, or himself any good in the end to be so naive to the state of man. Alfred Sawadogo, who worked with Sankara as an advisor on non-governmental organizations from 1984 until the coup, has described a complex, multi-sided individual. He was always surprising, sometimes exuberant, quarrelsome, teasing, funny, friendly, and warm. Sometimes hard, withdrawn, quick-tempered, stony-faced. Sometimes lyrical and poetic, his words powerful, deep, and real, but always true to himself. A nationalist to his core, an idealist, demanding, rigorous, and organizer. Sankara could be stubborn in his views, even when they were unpopular, yet he could also reverse himself when persuaded that he was wrong. In a draft of a speech that he was to have given to a group of military comrades on the day of his death, Sankara noted that, "We have benefited each time that someone considered it necessary to raise an opinion different from mine, to defend a position different than mine. These I have adopted and implemented, along with advice, suggestions, and recommendations." So obviously from his conduct of character and everything else, Sankara had his ego in check, maybe too much in check, as we see, but yeah, you could definitely see how he can be convinced that if he can be convinced there was a better way, he was willing to take it, even if it wasn't his way. Sankara's methods of work were unconventional. Although trained at military academies in rigorous planning and strategic thinking, he sometimes took initiatives in an ad hoc fashion, with little evident forethought about how they could be implemented. Sankara was the antithesis of a bureaucrat, Sawadogo commented. Sankara hated formalism and cumbersome, slow procedures. Functioning alongside the president, Sawadogo learned to work fast, think fast, act fast, make decisions, and be fully responsible for them. Sankara did not like it when anyone told him that a particular initiative had never been tried before or was impossible to carry out. He frequently declared, "That which man can imagine, he can achieve." Over time, Sawadogo recalled, those who worked with the president learned that by aiming for the seemingly unattainable, they were able to accomplish much more than they had ever dreamed. They could push the boundaries of what was possible. So you gotta love that mentality. They're just full of life. They're full of making dreams come to reality. It's a great path to set man on. And people will argue about how left was Sankara. Was he a communist, a socialist, a this or that? As he explained, he didn't want to attach any specific titles to his political beliefs. They were an assortment of everything we see with his fervent nationalism that, despite what he can be categorized as politically, he definitely was a passionate man, passionate about the success of his people and the unity of his people. Ordinary Burkinabe seemed to readily embrace Sankara's approach as they mobilized in their local communities to quickly build new schools, health clinics, and other facilities that had once seemed but a remote fantasy. But many of the country's civil servants were less eager to step up the pace. Sankara discovered that he had to combine persuasion with a good bit of coercion to get them to move more quickly and effectively in responding to the people's needs. And I think this is what the author was alluding to earlier when he spoke about the breakdown in communication between the People's Committee and the Parliamentary Functionary Service. That changed dramatically with the creation of the People's Revolutionary Tribunals, the TPRs. Their purpose was both repressive and educational, to punish crimes of corruption and embezzlement and to instill greater sense of morality in public life. Ordinary citizens, moreover, were to help implement that justice, departing from the practice of the old courts in which a single magistrate ruled over a case. The new tribunals were established as panels of professionals and lay judges, including one magistrate, perhaps a military or police officer, and 5 or 6 civilians chosen by local CDRs. The trials were public, often drawing large audiences, with the proceedings broadcast live over the radio. A dozen or more TPR trials over the next 6 months included among their defendants 44 former government officials of cabinet rank and above. A dozen were acquitted, but the rest were ordered to pay stiff fines and reimburse money they had embezzled. A number also received jail sentences. So they're having these trials. So in Machiavelli's mind, this would be another mistake Sankara had made, and that is prolonging the dispensing of justice. Because you're having these trials that are drawn out for some time, and they're taking the people of power of the society before Sankara, the people of wealth, that 10, 11% that could read, that were probably also the people of stature in that society. You're taking them and now you're putting them on trial, you're humiliating them, putting some in prison, taking money from others, and having just peasants judge them. So this built discontent within people, and it fermented, especially with the hierarchy of that country. As we will see, that's what continues to play out. You can't, as Machiavelli says, it is best to do it with one clean blow. He says, back to the prince again for a quick interjection of pragmatic philosophy here. Hence it is to be remarked that in seizing a state, the usurper ought to examine closely into all those injuries which it is necessary for him to inflict, and to do them all at one stroke, so as not to have to repeat them daily, and thus by not unsettling men, that he will be able to reassure them and win them to himself by benefits. He who does otherwise, either from timidity or evil advice, is always compelled to keep the knife in his hand. Neither can he rely on his subjects, nor can they attach themselves to him, owing to their continued and repeated wrongs. For injuries ought to be done all at one time, so that being tasted less, they offend less. Benefits ought to be given little by little, so that the flavor of them may last longer. So you're having these trials prolonged, and then you have everyone in the government, people positioned, thinking, oh my God, am I going to be next? I did something a year ago that they can bring up on me. So this is not going to have loyalty, or it's going to, in fact, create the opposite, subversion. They're going to try to find a way to get rid of him because they know they could be coming next on the chopping blocks. Well, if you would have just took care of the top 20 corrupt people in one stroke, and that's it, it's a clean slate, then you have these people now with the clean slate, now not having to worry about punishment from the past, being able to either get fully on board or eventually get their upcomings anyways by eventually getting caught with their continued corruption. But to prolong it makes the people paranoid, nervous, makes the people that could be brought up in these trials paranoid, nervous, and eager to do away with this drawn-out scenario of dispensing justice. Not all disciplinary measures led to trials. To help shake up a bureaucracy that moved at a lethargic pace, a number of civil servants were simply fired for incompetence, spending work hours in bars, or being politically disloyal. Sankara's CNR also tightened up considerably on the incomes and perks that state employees had come to expect. Numerous bonuses were simply eliminated. Various solidarity funds were set up to aid drought victims or contribute to public investment campaigns, with the contributions deducted directly from the government employees' pay packets. These measures caused considerable disgruntlement throughout the civil service. Government ministers and other senior officials lost their expense accounts. 2/3 of the government's auto fleet was sold off, and only small cars were kept, even for ministers. Officials who were assigned individual cars were strictly prohibited from keeping them outside working hours without permission. Like other parts of state administration, the military too had suffered from corruption and profiteering under old regimes. To clean house, the CNR hauled a number of senior officials before the TPRs, and some were found guilty and imprisoned. The new Revolutionary Discipline Councils were set up with the armed forces to hear cases of embezzlement, theft, unauthorized absence from duty, and other infractions. New garrison committees were also established along the lines of civilian CDRs, with representatives elected by General Assembly of officers and ranks. Military bases around the country started farms to grow food, raise livestock, engaged in tree planting to combat deforestation, cleaned up trash from towns and villages, dug wells and built schools, health clinics, roads, and other facilities. So he has, first they're cracking down on state workers, their perks, their paychecks, and then you got your military out here, doing good work for civilians, but they're military. They need to focus on war, and this also comes to bite Sankara in the butt in the future, in the near future here. And I think this is another instance where he would have did good by reading some Machiavelli. Back to the Prince. Because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, and lukewarm defenders and those who may do well under the new. Thus it happens that whenever those who are hostile have the opportunity to attack, they do it like partisans. So once again, you're punishing all the people that were doing good, and it's before you came around, and you're prolonging the method. And it's not to say that justice shouldn't be dispensed. It just has to be done so in a calculated and realistic manner. And on top of that, you have your military taking part now, in a large part, in civilian activities, and you're even having them under civilian councils as well, as you're starting to lose your military, which will continue this quote from Machiavelli as he explains how important it is to have the military at your side. And once again, the coup against Sankara was done by all military members. It is necessary, therefore, if we desire to discuss this matter thoroughly, to inquire whether these innovators can rely on themselves or have to depend on others, that is to say, whether to consummate their enterprise, have they to use prayers or can they use force. In the first instance, they always succeed badly. And you can say, instead of prayers here, hope, support, love of people and all this, and never compass anything. But when they can rely on themselves and use force, they are rarely endangered. Hence, it is that all the armed prophets have conquered, and the unarmed ones have been destroyed. Yeah, so you need that military on your side. You need that force. Just like Sankara's policies probably manifested discontent with the civil workers, it did so with military people as well. So yeah, you have to have sword in hand always. You could be a noble person, righteous person, love your people, but you must always have sword in hand. And this is another thing Sankara kind of got away from. Aside from its practical impact, this kind of activity had an educational function to help prevent soldiers from developing superior attitudes and to convince civilians that the army, alongside its usual functions, could also contribute to the country's economic advancement. At the same time, he added, military training was being extended to civilian supporters through the CDR's establishment of a reserve militia, in effect serving to demystify the military arts. Henceforth, the defense system would be composed not only of the army, it is composed of all the people. This is possible because the people trust us. Quote Sankara. Some of the underlying weakness of the regular army were highlighted during another brief border war with Mali in late December 1985. The Malian government attacked using the presence of Burkina Faso census takers in a disputed region as justification. So they were just looking for a reason to attack these, weak farming-ass soldiers over there. Burkina Faso armed forces with only small air force and very few tanks or armored cars were no match for the larger and better equipped Malian military. The Burkina Faso side suffered serious setbacks. Fortunately, mediators negotiated a ceasefire 5 days later, and both countries agreed to submit their border dispute arbitration by the International Court of Justice. Sankara acknowledged that the CNR had neglected equipping the army, believing that it would have been criminal to spend money on arms. Throughout his presidency, total regular troop strength remained steady at 9,000 men. Military expenditures as a share of total spending, however, hovered around 19%, only slightly higher than when the CNR first took power. Yeah, and that is completely opposite of what not only what Machiavelli preaches, but what history has shown us. This is why every country tries to build up their military. This is why Iran wants a nuke. This is why North Korea are flaunting their capabilities. Because these are bargaining chips. And these also protect you as well. They keep people away from attacking you. Like you see the Malayan country next door to them, who's also still a neo-colonial type state, essentially having yes men in office and taking funding from imperialist countries. They have this stronger military. They can come in there. Like if that peace wasn't negotiated and taken to the international courts, they would have ran through all of Burkina Faso. And then, what becomes of your vision then? But to Machiavelli once more on this topic, a prince ought to have no other aim or thought, nor select anything else for his study than war and its rules and discipline. For this is the sole art that belongs to him who rules, and it is of such force that it not only upholds those who are born princes, but it often enables men to rise from a private station to that rank. Because there is nothing proportionate between the armed and the unarmed. And it is not reasonable that he who is armed should yield obedience willingly to him who is unarmed, or that the unarmed man should be secure among the armed. So yeah, alongside building up his country, he should have built up his military as well, not left it stagnant. In December of 1983, he decreed the abolition of all laws on the designation of the chiefs and their territorial jurisdictions, and stripped them of any remaining state benefits or rights to collect taxes, tributes, or labor services. Most of the specific goals were of obvious and immediate benefit to the communities. Cleaning school and hospital courtyards, graveling roads, building mini dams to capture or channel scarce water for farm irrigation, and when building materials could be secured, even starting construction on schools, community centers, theaters, and other facilities. In the villages, the mobilizations were scheduled to not conflict with the normal farming or market activities. In the cities, where the rhythm of life was set more by standard work week of salaried employees, neighborhood general assemblies and work mobilizations usually took place on the weekends. These community mobilizations were put on a more systematic basis in the People's Development Program, PBD, launched in October 1984. Over the 15 months of the PPD, 351 schools, 314 maternal health centers and dispensaries, and 88 pharmacies were built, as were 274 water reservoirs and 2,294 wells and boreholes. So they're definitely transforming this society. You're getting a community effort here. So despite maybe animosity growing amongst the elite or the upper middle class. You're having the general people really benefiting from this structure of society. In the traditional and social structures of Burkina Faso, as elsewhere in Africa, elders usually held great social status and often monopolized decision-making. But with the arrival of the CNR, many of whose members were themselves relatively young, urban and rural youths finally saw new avenues to break from old social constraints. By actively supporting their communities, they not only acquired new organizational skills, but also enhanced their own sense of social worth. So once again, you're having the old chieftains and the elders. Now the youth are making more decisions and moves now. Even more than male youths, Burkinabe women previously had very few opportunities to mobilize in defense of their social and economic interests, organize politically, or engage directly with state institutions. The weight of traditional patriarchal relations bore down on them especially heavily. Most women were effectively relegated to the status of minors, whatever their age. From birth to death, many basic life decisions remained in the hands of their fathers, husbands, uncles, and other male relatives. As Sankara observed, our society, still too primitively agrarian, patriarchal, and polygamous, turns the woman into an object of exploitation for her labor power and of consumption for her biological reproductive capacity. Specific measures for women were built into many social and economic programs, from literacy classes specifically targeted towards women to the establishment of primary health units in each village, to support for women's cooperatives and market associations. A new family code was drafted. Among other things, it sought to set a minimum age for marriage, establish divorce by mutual consent, recognize a widow's right to inherit, and suppress the bride price and practice whereby a widow had to marry one of her late husband's brothers. Vigorous public campaigns were launched against female genital mutilation, forced marriage, and polygamy. Such practices were deeply rooted in Burkinabe society. However, this could not be eliminated by simple government decree or moral arguments. That did not stop Sankara and his colleagues from trying, but many of their efforts met with widespread rejection and incomprehension, including from some of the women themselves. In the political realm, however, the government did have the power to take unilateral initiative. At a time when hardly any women had reached high political or administrative positions in Africa, Sankara named several to cabinet posts, including as ministers of family affairs, culture, health, and the budget. Like many other African countries, the territory known as Upper Volta, Burkina Faso, was something of an artificial creation. The French conquest brought into one entity peoples who spoke some 60 different languages, observed Islam, Christianity, or indigenous African religions, and followed widely varied practices and customs. So there's a lot to deal with there. You have all these different ethnicities, probably have, who are very probably similar, but at the same time have little differences that can be used for division. You're going very women's rights, and you're getting some blowback from that, even from some of the women as well. The upper middle class have to take a pay cut. Military has to do a lot more civilian work, land beautification work than they would like. The upper bourgeois is now being taken to courts, largely ran by civilians, and they're being either fined or imprisoned or humiliated at the very least. So you can see there's discontent building there. You have the love of the people, but at the same time there's discontent fermenting amongst a couple different groups of your society. The Sankara era saw unprecedented blossoming of African cultural and ethnic representations. Many Burkinabe acquired a strong sense of pride in their specifically African identity and in cultural richness of their country. Sankara's vision of Burkina Faso's economic transformation was a basic one: improve the lives of its people. When the U.S. magazine Newsweek asked him how a poor country like his could develop, He did not lay out a sweeping agenda of industrialization and land redistribution, as the interviewer might have expected from someone who spoke of revolution. Sankara talked instead of building irrigation dams to help grow more food, constructing schools and health clinics, and setting up networks of small stores throughout the countryside so that villagers could secure their daily necessities. Our economic ambition, Sankara explained, is to use the strength of the people of Burkina Faso to provide for all 2 meals a day and drinking water. The government's emphasis on such small, tangible improvements did not mean it lacked a grand vision. In Sankara's 1983 political orientation speech, he declared that the aim was nothing less than the construction of a national economy that was independent, self-sufficient, and planned at the service of a democratic and popular society. The goal was echoed in the first 5-year economic development plan launched in 1986. The slogan of self-sufficiency, as generally used by Sankara and other leaders, did not mean cutting Burkina Faso's national economy off from the rest of the world, but it did imply reorientating it more towards domestic markets and interests. Burkina Faso first. Easy to proclaim, excruciating difficult to accomplish, since much of the economy was dominated by family agriculture with little industry of any kind. There were few sources of domestic revenue to finance expansion of productive capacities or social services. Yet the National Council of the Revolution, CNR, did set out a path of gradual transformation. Throughout its various programs, projects, and initiatives, several recurrent themes stood out. First, economic projects had to use local materials, labor, and financing as much as possible in order to reduce reliance on foreign aid and imports. Second, with equity as the watchword, those at top had to lose some of their perks so that those at the bottom could benefit. Third, whatever limited financial resources the government had at its disposal were allocated as a priority to rural areas, not urban centers. And fourth, in a country of scant rainfall and harsh climate, environmental concerns had to be integrated into all development efforts. Despite the CNR's revolutionary rhetoric, most of Burkina Faso's donors maintained their aid programs. However, much of that aid was tied to specific projects, over which the donors continued to exercise considerable decision-making authority, in contrast to funds allocated directly to the central budget, which the government controlled. France, the largest donor, halted all general budgetary support after 1983. The World Bank did the same after January 1985. So usually when you're not dealing with the World Bank or the World Bank doesn't want to deal with you, you're pretty much doing a good thing. One reason for the Burkinabe authorities' resistance about their foreign aid was their concern that it often came with strings attached. Justin Damo Barrow, who was finance minister during Sankara's first year, later revealed that he had tried on 4 occasions to persuade the president to ask for assistance from the International Monetary Fund, but Sankara declined on the grounds that the IMF conditionality would spell the end of the revolution. So kind of like how the Philippine leader Duterte is doing the same thing now with not taking foreign funds, because as soon as they start giving you money, they're going to start controlling your country. That's how it always works.
I look for the money somewhere. But to be accepting dollars from a country who thinks that you're a killer, why come to us and offer something? Keep your money. Do not meddle up with the sovereignty. Do not impose conditions. I am not about to. We are not rich, we are poor. A third world country. But you do not bargain the dignity by accepting their money, and they would make conditionalities that are not really acceptable to us, because it trims on the edge of violation of our sovereignty. As president, I have to protect the sovereignty of the Republic of the Philippines. I have to maintain that even at the expense of being pictured as a Birdogo, an executioner. Fine? What about it? Anyway, my duty is to my country. I only answer to the Philippines. I will not answer to any other bullshit, especially foreigners. Layoff. Offering us, I don't know how much this time, just to be okay. Except that there's just impact on the body. Rest in peace for all time.
By shifting decisions over basic economic policy away from Burkinabe and towards an external entity, during a discussion with me in March 1987, Sankara said that he had earlier asked the U.S. government to stop financing contingents of Peace Corps volunteers and instead provide an equivalent sum as a direct budget support. The United States refused, so the Burkinabe government suspended the Peace Corps program. So yeah, these organizations, they go there to help and, quote unquote help, but there's ulterior motive there always. So he essentially said, hey, you want to help so bad, just give us the lump sum, keep your little Peace Corps, give us your lump sum, and then we'll help ourselves with it. And of course, America refused because that's, not the agenda. And so Sankara banned them from promoting their peace there. Even when foreign volunteers carried out useful projects, Sankara said they might end up fostering a psychology of dependence on outside aid, as he put it in a Newsweek interview. In the final analysis, we know we have to depend on ourselves. Expressed as a percentage of gross domestic product, the government expenditures rose from 13.4% to 17.4%, and revenue from 13.5% to 16.3%. On the expenditure side, social services were strongly favored. From 1983 to 1987, public spending on education increased by 26.5% per person, and on health by 42.3%. In the regular annual budgets, the greater share of spending was shifted directly to agriculture. In the 5-year plan, some 71% of projected investments for the productive sectors were allocated to agriculture, livestock, fishing, wildlife, and forests. An even larger amount in recurrent spending was planned for irrigation, sanitation, and other water projects, with major portions of health, education, and transport investments destined for rural areas. Total cereal production rose by a spectacular 75% between 1983 and 1986. Much of that increase was due to more favorable rains, and output declined somewhat in 1987 because of poor weather. Yet the improvement in yields was also due to 25% more land being placed under irrigation between 1984 and 1987. In the Suru Valley, a dam was built within a few months almost entirely by volunteer labor, with 8,000 hectares of irrigated land devoted to cereal, rice, market gardening, and another 8,000 to growing sugarcane for a new sugar refinery. Along the country, use of fertilizer increased by 56% between 1984 and 1987. To help farmers better store and market their crops, hundreds of village cereal banks were built through collective labor mobilizations organized by the CDRs and other rural organizations. In the past, villagers with no way to store any surplus gains had no option but to sell them to local merchants. The merchants sometimes hoarded cereals to drive up prices, merchants being merchants, then later resold the grains back to the same villagers at perhaps twice the original cost. But the cereal banks, now managed by farmer groups, allowed villagers to buy back grain when they needed it at only a little more than its initial price. In August 1984, the government enacted new agrarian reform lands, which, among other things, nationalized all land. Previously, most rural land had been owned communally, with the chiefs generally deciding who could farm it. In some areas, however, private land ownership had begun to develop as urban land speculators sometimes acquired titles, either illegally from village chiefs or from commercial farmers who failed and had to sell their land. For most villagers, the agrarian reform shift from communal to state ownership would not bring any real change in their relationship to the land. Their rights to farm the land remain the same, yet by ending the risk that farmers could lose land to creditors or speculators, the law aimed to bring farmers greater security of tenure. To help raise public awareness and combat the alarming loss of vegetation, Sankara launched a campaign in early 1985 known as the Three Struggles. One struggle sought to end the unregulated and abusive cutting of trees for firewood, a problem worsened by unlicensed wood merchants who oversaw the wholesale razing of woodlands. Henceforth, Sankara decreed merchants would have to be licensed to cut only from designated areas and could transport wood only in specifically marked vehicles, with violators subject to criminal charges. Another struggle penalized the practice of setting bushfires to clear farmland, an activity that easily escaped control in the dry season. Finally, livestock herders were discouraged from allowing their cattle to wander unsupervised into farming areas where they could trample crops. Sankara warned bluntly that any grazing animal that destroys a planted tree or a cultivated grain will be shot, pure and simple. While allowed to operate, private businesses also came under greater scrutiny. They soon found out that the era of anything goes was over. Sankara assured that they could continue to make money, especially those of the sectors of national capital engaged in direct production. Private property is a normal thing at this stage of our society. It is normal that it should be protected, he said shortly after taking power. But what could not be accepted, he added, is private property dishonestly acquired. Merchants, especially those engaged in hoarding, price fixing, and various extortionate practices, discovered that the CNR was more energetic than previous regimes in trying to regulate their activities and intervene more directly in market operations. Large businesses had to contend with tax officials demanding that they paid their due share. Under the slogan, "Let's produce and consume Burkinabe," the Sankara government also encouraged manufacturers to produce more from local materials and consumers to buy more goods made locally. Bakers were urged to include a small portion of local corn, maize, flour in their bread, rather than just wheat, which was mainly imported. The CNR acted energetically to revive the manufacture of local clothes. Networks of women weavers were organized in cooperatives to produce faccio d'enfants, outfits for both men and women, often basic blue and white, but also in more elaborate colors and designs. To create a ready market for the clothes, the government obliged all civil servants to wear faccio d'enfants outfits to official ceremonies and events. Some state employees also regularly wore them to work, whether they generally liked the outfits or to curry favor with their supervisors, since wearing faccio d'enfants was often portrayed as a patriotic act. From Sankara's numerous declarations on international issues, several themes stand out. First, he sought to establish in the clearest terms that Burkina Faso no longer followed direction from Paris, or from Washington or other Western capitals. Second, as a sovereign nation, Burkina Faso would establish relations with any state it wanted to. Third, in keeping with its revolutionary ideals, the National Council of the Revolution, the CNR, would stand in solidarity with oppressed peoples and liberation movements. And finally, it would press for genuine Pan-African unity, which Sankara believed could be achieved only through action by African governments and peoples, not through an occasional common declaration issued at the close of a summit meeting. As the CNR gradually consolidated its position and overt security challenges were contained, Sankara shifted focus. He increasingly found himself trying to discipline those within the military, police, state bureaucracy, and committees for the defense of the revolution, the CDRs, who used their repressive powers arbitrarily against potential allies or even ordinary citizens. Sankara drew a distinction. While the revolution means repression of the exploiters of our enemies, it must mean only persuasion for the masses, persuasion to take on a conscious and determined commitment. Relations with the trade unions, especially those in the public sector, soured over the dismissal of state employees. Some were let go because of incompetence, but others because they were suspected of political disloyalty, sometimes for little more than past party affiliations. Most dramatically, a serious conflict developed between the CNR and the main primary school teachers union, led by supporters of Joseph Kai Zerbo, an internationally known historian, then living in exile in Senegal, who had been close to the previous military regime of Colonel Say Zerbo. In March 1984, the authorities ordered the arrest of several of the teachers' leaders. That prompted a 3-day protest strike, in which the Ministry of Education responded by dismissing some 1,300 teachers. Many Burkinabe were shocked by the severity of the reaction. That same year, political differences within the CNR and government led to the ejection of supporters of the African Independence Party, PAI. One of the group's best-known leaders, Saoumane Touré, also led a major labor federation, so the rift further strained relations with the unions. Over the next 3 years, Touré and other unionists were repeatedly detained. Matters came to a head in May 1987 when members of the CDR in Ouagadougou again arrested Touré, along with several others, accusing them of planning anti-government protests. The CDR publicly called for their execution, an especially provocative act since Sankara and Touré were known to be personal friends. Kiimdi, Sankara's aide, told me that Sankara opposed the detentions as damaging to the revolution. He quietly pressed for their release, and several of the lesser-known detainees were freed. Within the CNR, Sankara also fought to block the executions, which were favored by all but one of the political groups in the council. The loudest calls for execution came from the Union of Burkinabe Communists, which was close to Blaise Compaoré. Sankara later told a group of journalists that because of his stance, there now is a campaign against me. I'm accused of being a sentimentalist. Sankara's position on Touré's case was motivated not just by friendship. It reflected a broader shift during 1986 and 1987 to try to ease up the coercion and reduce social tensions. A number of the imprisoned officials of previous governments were let go, and several hundred of the dismissed teachers were rehired. Repeatedly, Sankara tried to persuade his comrades that the revolution could advance only if people were won over to its goals of their own free will, not through compulsion. The revolution, he said, needs a convinced people, not a conquered people, a convinced people, not a submissive people, passively enduring their fate. The aim should be to win over everyone. We are 8 million Burkinabe. Our goal is to create 8 million revolutionaries. Sankara was concerned about corruption not just among ordinary civil servants or CDR activists, but most especially among members of his own leadership team. Just a few days before the coup, Sankara told a group of journalists that today there are people in power who live better lives than the population, who engage in small-scale trade with Syrian and Lebanese merchants who find positions for their families, their younger cousins, all the while speaking in very revolutionary language. According to Fidele Toho, who was Minister of Labor at the time, one of Sankara's last acts was to propose a revolutionary code of conduct. He first introduced the idea at a Council of Ministers meeting chaired by Compaoré on October 7, 1987, and then led a discussion on the topic October 14th Council meeting chaired by Sankara in Compaoré's absence. The broad outlines of such a code, Toho later recounted, were to ensure that all leadership cadres had the endurance and intellectual capacity to fulfill their responsibilities and conducted themselves with honesty, integrity, and revolutionary morality. The most important measure to try and ensure such morality had come earlier that year. In February, Sankara established the People's Commission for the Prevention of Corruption, CPPC. Its main purpose was to collect and investigate information on the incomes and assets of all high officials to see whether they were living beyond their means. So he's really putting a magnifying glass over his own leadership here. And yeah, this is all about to come to an end here. Any anomalies were passed on to the police for further investigation, and if there was evidence of a possible crime, the perpetrator would be charged before the TPR. The CPPC's function said a CNR declaration was to help preserve our society and the revolution from the gangrene of corruption, a weapon used by imperialism and the bourgeoisie to lead astray revolutions from within. Sankara was the first to appear before the CPPC. According to his declaration of assets, he owned one house, on which he was still paying mortgage, 2 undeveloped plots of land, an automobile, several bicycles, a refrigerator, kitchen appliances, and several guitars. His monthly salary was equivalent to $462 at the time. He also reported that foreign leaders had given him gifts while traveling abroad, including 4 cars and more than CFA, their money, $850 million in cash. All of which, as a matter of policy, he handed over to the state treasury. Publicly, Sankara denied that he had any specific comrades in mind, but some of his colleagues later recalled that he sometimes expressed concerns about the influence of Campore's wife, who made little secret of her taste for luxuries. Campore himself was not very enthusiastic about the struggle against corruption. Whatever the weight of the individual ambition or corruption in the developments that led to Sankara's death, it is likely that the coup plotters also counted on support, tactic or otherwise, from wider segments of disgruntled social layers. All those who lost some of their powers and privileges as a result of Sankara's revolutionary venture, the social elites, land speculators, big merchants, traditional chiefs, all had good reason to see him go. Within the state bureaucracy itself, there were many senior civil servants, public functionaries, and military officers who did not see why they should have to make sacrifices to free up funds for rural development. They resented the trimming of their bonuses and resisted efforts to reassign them to provincial towns far from the capital's relative comforts. The CNR's stern anti-corruption measures stymied their aspirations for self-enrichment. Sankara recognized the risks of challenging this layer. In a 1985 interview, he told me, "The revolution in Africa faces a big danger, since it is initiated every time by the petty bourgeoisie. The petty bourgeoisie is generally made up of intellectuals. At the beginning of the revolution, the big bourgeoisie is attacked. That's easy. But after 1, 2, or 3 years, it is necessary to take on the petty bourgeoisie. And when we take on the petty bourgeoisie, we take on the very leadership of the revolution. To take on the petty bourgeoisie means to keep the revolution radical, and there you will face many difficulties. Or you can go easy on the petty bourgeoisie. You won't have any difficulties, but then it won't be a revolution either. It'll be a pseudo-revolution." Alright, let's go on to his assassination now. On the morning of Thursday, October 15th, 1987, Sankara met for several hours with Valery Somme at the presidential residence to discuss various matters. The most pressing among them, according to Somme, concerned the ongoing strains between Sankara and Campore, and among various political currents within the leadership. So Campore, we remember, Sankara brought him up his whole way up the ladder. Sankara carried Campore, and much to his own detriment now. Also that morning, Sankara drafted a speech to a meeting of the Revolutionary Military Organization to be held that evening. In it, he proposed a purification of the CNR and implementation of the Code of Conduct, among other measures, so as to dispel the distrust and suspicion that were infecting the revolution supporters and lessen the factionalism among its leaders. But it is a speech he would never deliver. That afternoon, Sankara had a scheduled meeting with a small team of advisors. They gathered about 4:15 at the old Conseil d'Entente headquarters, which for some time had served as the office of the CNR. The meeting was underway for only a brief time when shooting erupted in a small courtyard outside, around 4:30 p.m. or shortly after. Sankara's driver and 2 of his bodyguards were the first to be killed. Upon hearing the gunfire, everyone in the meeting room quickly took cover. Sankara then got up and told his aides to stay inside for their own safety. "It's me they want." He left the room, hands raised, to face the assailants. He was shot several times and died without saying anything more. If his exit from the room was intended to save his comrades inside, it failed. The gunmen, all in military uniform, entered the meeting room and sprayed it with automatic weapons fire. Everyone inside was killed except for Alona Traore, who survived his wounds and later gave the only eyewitness account of the attack. Compaoré denied that he had issued orders for Sankara's assassination and claimed to have been at home in bed ill at the time of the killing. Your regular Ferris Bueller. Many found it hard to believe that his men would have acted on their own. And they were Compaoré's men. The killers included Sergeant Cafando, Compaoré's aide. He and the other known assailants all served directly under Captain Gilbert Diendier, then the commando of the Po Commando Base, soon to become the head of Compaoré's military security force. Because of their actions, Compaoré was no longer just number 2. By that evening, he was the new president. The radio broadcasted very little hard information, not even an official announcement of Sankara's death. It only reported that the CNR government and a few other institutions had been dissolved and replaced by a mysterious Popular Front, headed by a new president, Captain Blaise Compaoré. The airways were also filled with invective. Sankara was vilified as a traitor to the revolution, a petty bourgeois, a petty bourgeoisie, who consorted with bourgeois potentates and was guided by mystic forces, a Masonic who ran a one-man show, a fascist. The people were also disgusted when they learned that Sankara and 12 comrades slain with him had been buried unceremoniously with no grave markers in Dagnonin Cemetery on the edge of one of the capital's poorer neighborhoods. Ties with France improved markedly. The French authorities not only regularly welcomed Compaoré to Paris, but even awarded their National Order of the Legion of Honor to Colonel, later General, Gilbert Diendier, the officer who commanded Sankara's executioners. In the first few years after the coup, it was very risky for any Burkinabé to publicly proclaim their admiration for the late president. Many who had worked closely with Sankara or refused to support the new regime were detained, beaten, driven into exile, or executed. And Compaoré went on to rule, I think, for about 23, 25 years after that, until just not too long ago, he's finally ousted out of government. And you can best believe when he was in power, he was not a minimalist. He was all about styling and profiling. All those corruption courts quickly ended, and the funding from the West started up all over again. So that is the story of Thomas Sankara, an upright man who tried to create an upright nation, but was cut short in his quest by the reality of the all-too-human situation. Even though Sankara went out of his way to try to fix his nation, to try to raise up his people, and to try to show his people he didn't want to be worshipped as an avatar or as a cult of personality, or he even wanted to be considered just simply one of them. While noble in intention, naive in reality. And yes, he was loved. He was loved by the people. But they didn't do anything when he was killed. At least, they didn't ferment their own revolution and dispose of Compaore, the traitor, immediately. Decades later just came about, and not even for its initial cause. And he's still not met with justice for his crimes against his friend who brought him up. So on that matter, on Sankara's unavenged death by his people he tried to raise up, we finish with Machiavelli. Upon this question arises whether it is better to be loved than feared or feared than loved. It may be answered that one should wish to be both, but because it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved, when of the two either must be dispensed with, because this is to be asserted in general of men, that they are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, covetous, and as long as you succeed, they are yours entirely. They will offer you their blood, property, life, and children, when the need is far distant. But when it approaches, they turn against you. And so it was. Even though the common people had loved him, they weren't willing to sacrifice to the death to avenge him. That's why Machiavelli says, desire to be both feared and loved, but if you can only choose one, it is better to be feared. Because the military coup led by Compaore against Sankara knew his main love came mainly from the plebs of society, from the people without power. They knew that the media, they knew that the unions, they knew that the government workers, the bourgeois and the petty bourgeois, all had complaints, and these were the hierarchy of that society. Thus, they really didn't fear any repercussions of assassinating Sankara. So that is the story, the life and times of Thomas Sankara. A lot can be learned from the successes and failures of Thomas Sankara.